Hi, everybody. Welcome to K-Corp. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jack Alpert. Jack is the director of Stanford Knowledge Integration Lab. He started that in 1978 at Stanford University. And in 1992, it left Stanford and became a nonprofit research foundation. The research focused on how people gather and process information to understand dynamic systems. And over the years, the lab has transitioned its focus to the relationship between human cognition and civilization viability. The current work is on discovering and implementing a viable civilization. 8 billion people live today because energy and materials can produce their food and services. If in 80 years, fossil fuels cannot be produced, and without them, solar and wind machines cannot be built and maintained, and new energy delivery systems cannot be brought online, the remaining energy deliveries to Earth's civilization circa 2100 will be limited to the forests, which will support only 600 million people living like 17th century serfs. The population decline will be caused by 8 billion people starving to death or dying in conflict fighting over food. I, meaning Jack, has a plan for preventing these deaths. However, it is too painful to implement without believing, emphasis on without believing civilizations running out of gas story. So after Jack makes his presentation, we'll have conversation, questions, and observations from the participants, and you can put your questions into chat at any time. So without further ado, take it away, Dr. Jack Alpert.
Thank you for your kind remarks about me and your wonderful introduction to this talk. I would like to extend a very special thank you to K-Corp, Art, Jean, Ted, John, Dave, Barry, and others for their efforts to introduce into the current discussion clear images of our civilization's unfolding reality. They have continued to support this simulation produced at MIT in 1972. This is an image of 4 of its variables between 1900 and 1970. The green line shows food per capita, the yellow line shows industrial output per capita, and the black line shows population, all increasing during the interval. The red line shows percentage resources left on the Earth's crust, assuming 100% in 1900. The descending red line shows that by 1970, 15% of the easy accessed resources had been consumed by humans. After advancing the simulation forward in time, the team discovered declining reserves of resources combined with increasing population would inhibit further increases in food per capita and industrial output per capita. Eventually, exhausting some resource reservoirs would cause food per capita and industrial output per capita to descend. Population would continue to increase exponentially for 20 years. However, as starvation rose due to declining per capita food, deaths equal births and population peaked. Population declined almost 50% by 2100. While the population contraction was clearly visible in the 1972 plots, it was not reported as an important finding. Maybe it was too dreadful to consider, and maybe being too far in the future, it might have been considered too uncertain. Here today, with 50 years more data, this uncertainty is greatly reduced. Today, 2013, we know population, the black line, ramped up faster and higher, reaching 8 billion. Increases in fossil fuel production, that's more discovered and more developable reservoirs, made possible feeding each person better and giving each more industrial production. Yet, the exhausted reservoir problem means we are still facing a 90% or more drop in fossil fuel deliveries this century. If these lost energy deliveries cannot be replaced by another energy source like wind and solar, the remaining energy deliveries will be able to support only 10% of the 8 billion. The world's 8 billion population is facing a 90% decline. When you add 80 years of births to today's living 8 billion, the number that starves to death or dies fighting over food exceeds 10 billion. In the remainder of this talk, I will present the mechanisms of population decline, the mechanisms of energy declines, and how to compute starvation and conflict deaths this century.
We live on a beautiful planet with lots of happy, loving people. However, everything is not perfect. Some people die because there are too many of us. You work to prevent your kids from being in this group. However, how do you know if you will be successful? Maybe this biologist can help you measure your potential for success. By observing rabbits on an island, he found the rabbits expand their population until the grass can feed no more. Then each bunny that is born makes one too many to feed. It or another rabbit dies of starvation. The population oscillates at this limit. Expanded, it looks like this. For each year, births equal starvation deaths. Since the oldest rabbits are the weakest food gatherers, each dies of starvation. When no rabbit on the island dies of old age, all die of overpopulation. If I plot these deaths and births on this axis, an estimate of the 84 years of overpopulation deaths, the brown columns, is the sum of these birth columns. Now in theory, if the rabbits were just a little smarter, and a few years before reaching the grass support limit, say 2010, they changed their procreative behavior from having many births each year to having the same number of births as the annual old age deaths, then population would oscillate below the grass limit. Expanded, it would look like this. During 2010, for example, births would equal old age deaths. Let me plot them on this axis. Because the maximum population never exceeds grass support, there would be 0 overpopulation deaths for the year. Filling in future years, we notice that if all the rabbits born die of old age, then the estimate for overpopulation deaths for the century is 0. Now, if humans were as smart rabbits, if civilization gave all women their rights, assisted each so she could have the children she wanted, and collectively all of these decisions resulted in annual births being equal to old age deaths, would there be no deaths from overpopulation? Not exactly. In our world, we already have deaths that result from overpopulation. Let me quantify them. In the year 2016, the change in population equals the births minus old age deaths minus overpopulation deaths, which is plotted here. If technology kept food production increasing and population followed, and these overpopulation deaths remained constant over time, Then we can estimate the overpopulation deaths for the century by summing these 84 columns. If food production stopped growing and we got as smart rabbits, we stopped population growth, and the number of annual deaths from overpopulation remained constant, then the sum of overpopulation deaths for the century would be the same. However, if food production fails to increase as fast as population and the two curves intersect like rabbits on a full island, annual human births would predict annual starvation deaths. To estimate the number of overpopulation deaths for this century, sum the yearly births. Today, there are 127 million births per year. 84 times that number equals more than 10 billion overpopulation deaths. Of course, this estimate assumes food production holds constant and no other processes beyond starvation cause premature deaths. In human civilization, overpopulation deaths are also caused by violence. Also, human starvation deaths are not related to the amount of pasture grass. The deaths are related to food production and food distribution. Food production depends on direct human activity, like agricultural processes, and indirect activities like civilization supports, as well as deliveries of energy and renewable resources. The direct activities include labor, irrigation, fertilization, harvesting, storage, processing, and transport. The indirect supports include economies of scale, specialization of labor, rule of law, in-place infrastructure, working technology, education, and advancement of science. The rabbits rely on an inexhaustible source of energy, sunlight, to produce their food. Humans use exhaustible energy sources like gas, oil, and coal. When humans used only wood to fuel civilization, the global population struggled to exceed 600 million people. Only the use of fossil fuel allowed humans to grow food for 7.4 billion people. Rabbits live inside the limits of their renewing resources. To feed 7 billion, humans, among other renewable excesses, overfish oceans, erode and demineralize soil, and empty aquifers that took millennium to fill. Rabbits cause no overpopulation deaths through food distribution. Humans do. For example, humans divert food to waste. They throw food away. They use it for fighting wars. They use it for repairing things they broke in wars. Humans divert food to make transportation fuel. They divert food to feed animals. And the rich divert food from the poor. Finally, rabbits don't kill each other when they suffer scarcity. Human inequity sufferers, well-being losers, hierarchy creators kill each other to resolve scarcity. They also kill each other indirectly by disrupting food production and altering food distribution. All these processes contribute to overpopulation deaths. Let me demonstrate the deaths from just one process, the decline in energy deliveries. What if Mother Nature serves up her biggest curse, a 92% drop in energy deliveries by the end of the century? If this means a 92% drop in food deliveries, then there could be a 92% drop in population. Only 8% of the globe's 7.4 billion people could be fed, and only 600 million would survive after 2100. To make the calculations of overpopulation deaths for the century easier, imagine the hypothetical case where no one was born, no one died of old age, no one died in conflict, and all deaths were due to food shortfalls. Then, overpopulation deaths would total 7 billion people. In the real world, children would be born. This would increase annual starvation deaths. Then, a conservative estimate of the number of people dying due to overpopulation in our world in the next 84 years would be over 10 billion. 10 billion would die even if we could stop deaths resulting from climate change, soil loss, water scarcity, or pollution. 10 billion would die even if we prevented inequity, social conflict, and civilization collapse. Combined with too many people, just declining energy deliveries could kill all our children. Have we been underestimating overpopulation? During Apollo 13's trip to the moon, a tank explosion lost a portion of the mission's energy. The mission commander reported, "Houston, we have a problem." Not only was there not enough energy to let the astronauts land on the moon, just getting safely back to Earth was going to be a challenge. Earth, with its human crew, is also about to lose a portion of its supporting energy. Our civilization and population will be lucky to remain intact to the end of this century. I make such a bold statement because for oil, the acquisition energy will soon be larger than the delivered energy, and thus oil will not be a support for our civilization. Let's take a closer look. The energy from an oil well is used to find the oil, build the drill rig, drill the well, pump the oil out of the ground, pipe it to the refinery, refine it, and transport it to your car. It is also used to build roads, trucks, and gas stations. The energy is used to house, feed, educate, entertain, provide health care and retirement for all the people and their families involved in delivering your gas. Only the energy left over after all these tasks are completed can be put in your tank. If finding the oil takes more energy, less makes it to your tank. If building the drill rig takes more energy, less makes it. With other increases, no gas makes it. If we used energy from electric plants to accomplish some tasks, then some gas makes it. If pumping takes more energy, gas can make it to your tank, but only if the workers give up some of their services, for example, retirement and health care. By the end of this century, these tasks could become so energy consumptive, no workers get services and no gas gets to your tank. When I made these calculations for coal, the story was the same. For gas, the same. Even uranium won't deliver energy at the end of the century. I know what you're thinking. Soon, these renewable sources will replace the ones lost. However, renewable stories may be the same. If the energy produced by a wind turbine is used to build, transport, and install them, create energy storage units for no wind periods, create the distribution grid including the required roads and bridges, and in the long run, repair and replace everything listed above, then wind turbines might not deliver energy above that needed to keep themselves running. They may not be a source of energy to run our civilization. Even with further development, solar, geothermal, and tidal systems, after paying their own energy bills, might not deliver usable energy. I hear you saying, don't worry, atomic technology will supply our energy needs. We will have liquid salt reactors and fusion reactors. However, consider that each of these new technologies requires energy from oil, gas, coal, and uranium systems to finish their development and build out their installations. What if these tasks will take too long or require too much energy, and these sources become exhausted before these technologies can be completed? Then these new technologies may never deliver energy. It may be that existing energy sources renewing energy sources, and new technology sources won't be powering our civilization at the end of this century. It may be that within the lifetime of our children, our civilization supporting energy will change from this back to this. Now, that might not sound so terrible. Agrarian energy systems were enough to allow the Egyptians to build the pyramids, the Romans to build the Colosseum, and the Mughals to build the Taj Mahal. These architectural feats were created using the above subsistence energy that these civilizations extracted from farms and forests. For example, to build the Taj Mahal, Mughal farms fed 20,000 men and thousands of oxen and elephants for 22 years. Crop energy supported not only the direct building efforts, but the overhead task of farming the crop, cooking, raising kids, burying the dead, building and maintaining roads, waterworks, storage facilities, administration, marshaling an army to protect the empire's assets, and make campaigns of acquisition. Today, cheap energy makes possible all these tasks and lets many of us live like kings. Let me put the Mughal civilization's use of agricultural energy to perform work in context with our civilization's use of fossil fuels to do the same. Consider yourself at a gas station with a car with an empty tank, and you put in 1 gallon of gas and you pay $4. Then you drive the car on the freeway about 30 minutes until it runs out of gas. How many people working together through some mechanism create enough energy to return the car to the gas station in 30 minutes? The answer following these assumptions and calculations is 128 day laborers. And since the work of 128 laborers equals the work of a gallon of gas, and a gallon of gas costs $4, then each person would have to be willing to do the 30 minutes of work for 3 cents. It follows that in a fossil-fueled civilization, human labor has a value of 6 cents an hour. This means that when you drive a car powered by gasoline, each of us uses 128 very cheap energy slaves. Besides not costing much, energy slaves do not have to be supplied with food, lodging, healthcare, coffee breaks, vacations, or support for their families. Nor does the system have to build and maintain the contraption that converted their labor into car motion. No wonder that in our civilization, to accomplish most of these activities, we used energy slaves rather than people. Not only do energy slaves eliminate the need for 128 laborers to make driving a car possible, but projects like the Taj Mahal can be completed in years rather than decades. If by the end of this century most of the energy slaves are not available, then most of our civilization's energy will again have to come from forests and agriculture. That energy will have to pass through our kids so they can perform menial labor. Our kids will still be able to build projects like the Taj Mahal, but they will also have to live in squalid huts with no running water, sewage, or electricity, do without education and health care, and their diets will be limited to beans and rice twice a day. When agriculture delivers most of our energy, we should expect one more change. Our children won't number 7 billion or greater. India's 16th century Mughal Empire, existing in the world's best bottomland, supported only 150 million people. In 1700, the world contained only 4 times this kind of land, and it supported only 4 times that population, or 600 million. Today, with energy slaves using most of the land in each country that can be plowed, planted, irrigated, pest controlled, harvested, and using roads and trucks to transport and machines to process food, the earth keeps 7 billion from starvation. However, should we lose today's energy slaves? Should renewable energy slaves never replace them? Should new technology energy slaves never come online? agricultural energy could feed possibly 600 million people. If this analysis is correct, during this century, our ability to feed 7 billion could drop to 600 million. 9 of every 10 of our children could starve to death or die fighting over food. Losing our energy slaves could mean humans. We have a problem.
Running out of gas story tells how to compute the number of starvation and conflict deaths this century. It's not that difficult to calculate. If you've been paying attention the last 30 minutes, you know that because we won't be able to extract fossil fuels, uranium, metals, and minerals from the crust in 2100, the Earth will support only 600 million people living like 17th century serfs. There are 8 billion people living today. Another 8 billion could be born by the end of this century. A total of 16 billion people will live during the next 80 years. However, if only 600 million are alive in 2100, 15.4 billion died. This group has a chance of dying of old age. If this number is 8 billion, you can subtract it from this 15.4 billion to get 7.4 billion that died of starvation and conflict. This may sound like a sad story, but it's not the whole story. For it to be true, the Earth would have to support 8 billion people in each of these 80 years. If we assume these supports will decline at a similar rate as fossil fuel deliveries each year, the Earth will support less than 8 billion. Maybe 4 billion deaths can be added to the 7.4 billion deaths, increasing the estimated starvation deaths to 11.4 billion. Starving people cause conflict. Conflict could kill additional people, increasing the 11.4 billion tragic deaths estimate. Conflict can divert supplies to the war effort, further diminishing supplies to feed the population. This would also increase the 11.4 billion estimate. Finally, conflict damages production and distribution of supports, increasing the 11.4 billion death estimate. While these three factors might increase the 11.4 billion death estimate toward 15.4 billion, birth reduction could decrease the estimate. More birth could increase the estimate. Technology may bring online an alternative energy source, for example, fusion, and this could decrease the estimate. Transitioning humankind to a non-carbon oxygen life form, requiring much fewer crustal supports, and this could decrease the death estimate. However, barring these technological breakthroughs, I hope these views of starvation and conflict deaths might motivate altering the present path of human civilization, no matter how painful the required changes in human behavior. And now you know my civilization's running out of gas story. Thank you for your attention. I'll be glad to take your questions.
Yep. So thank you, Jack. And for those of you who want to submit questions to Jack or comments, put them in the chat and I'll try to deal with them in order. So I think the first person up is Peggy Atherton. You had a comment. Peggy, are you there? And put your mic on if.
Okay. I did a calculation of the last few weeks to estimate what my use of gas energy was for hot water heater. and it came to 8 cubic meters. Just thought that might be useful information. I have switched to a heat pump, so I'm using less gas, and the only other gas utility that I use is a fireplace. And that's just a comment.
Okay, so reduced consumption. Any comment on that, Jack?
Peggy, I can see that you live in a wonderful house with painted walls and pictures hanging, and the lights are on, and you
Yes.
probably have a car, and
Yes,
you drive on
mhm.
public roads,
Yeah,
and you probably go to the public library, and you probably have a computer, and you have an internet connection, and you have to add all those things to your energy budget, and then ask me again how much you can reduce your consumption.
okay. I have an EV car.
Do
I
you
use
think that
about,
an EV car takes less energy in total than your old, internal combustion engine car?
yes, I estimated it costs me about $135 a year in electricity charges. Not sure what the kilowatt hours are.
Peggy, that's a really good point. And I'd like you to do the calculations in mass and joules, not in dollars. Anytime
I
you
don't know.
introduce dollars into the calculation,
Yeah.
they're rubbery. But if you
Uh,
talk about joules and you talk about mass, and then you talk about the joules and mass to create and drive your internal combustion engine car or your EV car, it's not how many pennies you saved in your budget. The question is, did you really use less joules and less mass to move your
Uh,
body to the grocery store?
Yes, I don't know. I'm not very good at calculating joules.
Good. Okay, well, thank you, Peggy. Art, you're on deck. I just have a question, Jack, or a comment maybe. I'm familiar with boom and bust curves, and mankind has moved well beyond the point where we're sustainable, yet life has never been better. We sort of know that we're not sustainable, yet life's never been better. So how important is this as a psychological factor, and why we don't want to believe that things are so bad?
Gary, that's a really good question. Let's assume that you're in a car and you're driving along and it's going 60 miles an hour and the air conditioning's on and the wonderful sound system is producing wonderful feelings. Of course, you're driving out into the desert and you're almost out of gas. And when you run out, the car stops. And you
Yep.
can't walk back out of the desert. So you're dead. So in terms of how we feel about our present condition is no different than how these people feel in their car. They won't know the consequences until the car stops moving. Then the consequences become clear. You can't really imagine, you have to be able to imagine the injury that hasn't occurred yet, which is my area of study. None of us do it very well.
So life's going pretty
If you
well.
want the data on that, I did a test. I wrote a test for how people manage problems when the future events are knowable, but they haven't occurred. And I wrote it for fifth graders, and I gave it to them. This is Palo Alto. I gave it to a bunch of Palo Alto fifth graders, and they were supposed to manage an island and keep everybody alive, and most of them couldn't do it. In fact, almost all but one of them didn't do it. And I said, wow, that's pretty exciting. So then I tried it on Stanford freshmen, and they didn't do it. And then I tried it on Stanford graduate students in all the different departments, and they didn't do it. And then I tried it on the Stanford faculty, and they didn't do it. And then I went around and got the 6 or 7 Nobel laureates that I could get to take this test. And I want you to know that as your sample size gets smaller, the data security gets lower and lower. But the inference is that in this particular domain of making decisions, like driving out in the desert and imagining what it's like to run out of gas, the Nobel laureates and the fifth graders are exactly the same. None of them see what's going on, and none of them can imagine something bad happening because they've lived in that air-conditioned car going down the road at 60 miles an hour with a great sound system playing Bach and Chopin, and till the lights go out, everything's fine.
Yet you said the future's known, Jack. So these people presumably knew that they were living in a non-sustainable environment.
I mean, it was known because they experienced it. And they had never experienced that system with the lights out.
Okay, thank you very much. Art, you had a question.
Yes. There are only two sources of real energy that have been around since the Big Bang. And they are, of course, both fusion energy, which takes place in the stars and our sun. We also have fusion that is beavering away at the Earth's core, generating temperatures up to 6,000 degrees C, the same as the temperature in the surface of the sun. So geothermal energy is rising to the surface. It's available everywhere on the planet, as is solar energy. In some places, you can get more solar due to prevailing winds, cloud cover, snow, and all those other things. The same thing with geothermal. So it's not uniformly available, but it's a near infinite source that says all you have to do is go there and collect it. And so one can then start talking about the technologies of collecting that energy, and this then becomes quite interesting because collecting some of it is quite easy. And I know, Jack, that you've talked in the past about high dependency on dams, and that itself is, of course, a form of solar energy causing evaporation, condensation, etc. So I'm trying to envision this future where one is deprived of both solar and geothermal. Why will those not be available to support life?
Well, obviously, we're going to have the same solar input after 2100 as before. So, but we still have photosynthesis, and which is dependent on land area and crops. So we have solar working 100%, growing crops wherever those crops can be grown. And the numbers for that are 600 million. That's the number of people that can actually grow crops using photosynthesis when they don't have other energy sources to irrigate and harvest and transport and process. Now, geothermal, you mentioned, is a source that if you can drill down and get the heat and get it extracted and run it, heat water with it and run it through a turbine, then that's an energy source. And there certainly are energy sources in Iceland that are running aluminum smelting plants. So it's not fictitious. They're doing it. Now, whether or not it's going to last forever, whether or not they're only doing it on a dollar basis, not a joule basis, For example, the heat that comes out of a geothermal well isn't hot enough to make steel, but they needed the steel to actually drill down and create the ability to create geothermal energy from the Earth's latent heat. So if we were going to support the entire world on geothermal wells, we would have to get it all in place with steel that was built with coal and oil and gas. You couldn't build coal and you couldn't build that steel with what comes out of a geothermal well. So
I guess, Jack, well, what I'm saying is, I've been living for 7 years on geothermal energy to heat my place. I have not drilled down to the center of the earth and run a big plant. I'm only down 8 feet, and I'm collecting energy, geothermal energy, without all the massive infrastructure you've been talking about. And there is, in fact, a lot of developments which are happening globally that are looking at geothermal shallow as well as solar, and collecting together in microgrids, virtual power plants, and other activities that are going on, using both the sun and geothermal. It is a reality, and it's not something off in the future. And I'm just suggesting that, yes, I'll certainly accept the fact that 8 billion people can't do this, but I'm suggesting that perhaps your survivors of 600 million might be the very bottom. There might be something somewhat higher than that, because they are harvesting both solar and geothermal energy. That's my point.
Okay, Jack, you can respond, and then I think we better move on to Jean Doherty, who's next.
Art, I know that you have a solar plant that is photovoltaic, and you've just explained that you have a heat pump which harvests differences in temperature between the outside temperature and the ground temperature. But what you haven't explained is how that plumbing got in there and where it came from and how many joules it took to put it in the ground, build it in a steel plant or whatever the pipes are made out of. And you haven't talked about the energy that made the electric power. Are you using the power from your photovoltaic panels to build and drive your heat pump?
Not to build, but to drive, yes.
Okay, well, so what do you think the percentage is of the energy that it takes to run the electric motor to run your heat pump to the energy it took to build the machines that dug the trenches, that laid the pipe, that the roads and bridges that brought the pipe to your house, the wells that were drilled in oil that was converted to a refinery to drive the trucks that facilitated you building the heat pump system at your house. And then if you took that all away, you'd have to say, how am I going to keep my heat pump going and replace my solar panels, which only have a life of 15 to 20 years? Where does the energy come from to rebuild those panels? From the heat pump energy or from the solar energy out of the panels? And I'm claiming that what we're not doing is doing the adding and subtracting to see whether or not that's imaginary or real. Now, if you do it in dollars, you can make it look like it's real. But if you do it in mass and joules, it's much harder.
Mark,
Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, over to you, Jean, and Mike Nickerson, you're on deck.
Thank you very much, Jack. A very interesting presentation, I must admit. What I'm looking at all the various existential crises that we as a human population and civilization are starting to face. And certainly looking back 50 years ago when the Limits to Growth was first published, the one major element that they talked about was in fact the population, human population being a problem, and they grouped all the other resources together as just resources. And they came up with the fact that we had too many people, or we were very fast approaching too many people. Now, what you said was you've basically explained this in a little bit more detail, but how do you anticipate, how do you think we can actually try and deal with our human population problem? How do you get us to reduce the population when people, it's not something that anybody wants to talk about, and it's definitely an elephant in the room?
Oh, Gene, it's a really good question. The way that I'm trying to get people to talk about it is to make explicit what the current path is. Right now, as Barry pointed out, everything's good and it's been getting better our entire lives.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no idea that in the next week, the lights could go out and not come back on. And to give you, there's a very good book called The American Famine, written by Kurt Dahl. And he essentially has taken a group of terrorists and taken out the major transformers in the United States. And the question was, if you took out these transformers and there's 2 years of lead time to get them rebuilt and put back online, that the United States can't deliver food. I mean, when the lights go out, we're done. And we can't. So what happens in this book is that cannibalism becomes the normal operandi, the same as Cormac McCarthy's The Road. I mean, you eat what's available. Okay, so on one hand, you say we can't get people to talk about the elephant in the room, but on the other hand, you can't get people to talk about what happens when the lights go out. All I'm trying to say is we have to be able to make it perfectly clear what it's like when the lights go out. So if there's somebody sitting in the back seat of the car and let's assume the car has a 400-mile range and it's going out in the desert, and the guy figures out that we're going to run out of gas at the 400-mile mark, we're all going to die. So the guy sitting in the back seat, he says, if we don't turn around right now, we're all dead. And everybody says, oh man, don't give me that. Okay, what should he do? And that's what you're talking about. How severe the behaviors are very painful. That's the whole point. The behaviors are almost as painful as just blundering forward and suffering the consequences. So all I'm trying to do is make explicit what the consequences are. Who's going to get injured and when? And when anybody says that they're going to turn their thermostat down, then I ask the question, how many of the 15.4 billion are we talking about saving if you turn your thermostat down? So people have to give away all of their 16 improvements in their life because they don't have any meaning. And they have to talk about penalties in their life, like not having kids.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And say, oh my God, not having kids is an enormous penalty. However, it's less of a penalty than having 15.4 billion people, everybody we know and love, and everybody we can imagine in the future, they're going to die terrible deaths. So if we can't give that meaning, then we can't talk about we can't talk about the elephant in the room. And we have to talk about the elephant in the room. And the transition, all the plans for making a transition have to do with how we stop having kids for 50 years. And I mean, no kids.
Yeah.
Everybody who's in this meeting knows that the population of the world in 2100, if we have no kids, is 0. Everybody will die from old age between now. All 8 billion of us will die between now and 2100 from old age. And the only thing that counts is the replacement parts. How many people should we have to be the replacement parts so that the people in 2100 can have some sort of a life.
I
That
do.
answer your question,
yeah.
Jane?
Well, it does and it doesn't, because with regards to, it sort of brings to mind two or three different things. Malthus, for example, when you started to do the population studies on animals, they realized that the natural birth rate of organisms, as overpopulation happened, the natural birth rates started to decline. So there was no thought involved. It was just the natural birth rate. We also have, the dystopian futures where you start seeing things like one of the where people are killing each other all over the place, and nobody is really making any sense in terms of putting forward for the future. So you're talking in generalities, but you haven't given some more specific things. One of the main things that I've heard, you just said, nobody has children, but how do we make a decision as to who's going to have children? Where in the world's population are you going to have it? Is it going to be in the Western or the developing nations? All of those things. And you have to start looking and putting power in the hands of women to be able to have and make decisions over their own bodies and reproductive rights.
Okay, Jack, you can respond to that, and then we should move on to Mike.
Okay. You mentioned a number of things that, Jane, I lost your picture, so I'm watching your face. There we go. You mentioned a number of things, one of which is giving power to women and educating women, and so that they'll have a fewer number of children. And let's assume that you're very successful, universally successful. Every woman gets to choose exactly how many children they want. And it turns out in a developed society, a third of the women will choose no children. And a third of the women will choose one child, and the other third will have to have some kids. So the question is, how fast did those decisions lower the population? So let's assume it lowers the population to 3 billion people in 2100, but you can only feed 600 million. So what you've learned is even all of those solutions, the discussion of having everybody be better educated and doing a better job of choosing the children they want, that's not enough. You're still going to have enormous injury, and everybody should stop talking. That's sort of like the person who's driving into the desert, and somebody says, we're going to run out of gas at 400 miles. And somebody says, turn down the air conditioner. Okay, well, car goes 450 miles instead of 400. Does it change anything? You did a good behavior. What happens if another person says, open the back door and drag your foot? Is that going to make a difference? So it isn't that we haven't got good behaviors to do. It's just whether or not the good behaviors are enough. And my field is what's enough. I think we just lost Charlie.
Thank
Charlie
you.
Hall was in this, and almost all the stuff that you saw was from Charlie's work. I'm sorry he left.
No, I'm here.
I wanted to draw
Thank
him
you.
in sooner,
I'm
but
here. Can you hear me?
oh, I can hear you, Charlie. Where are you?
What? But
Oh,
Art,
just
you
moved you
turned
around. You put
off
your-
my
you put
video.
your
I
hand
can't
up.
turn on my video.
Well,
So
Charlie is really, the father of all the knowledge that I just presented.
okay, it's up
And
to
I did
Barry.
not
Do you want
create-
Charlie
I
to
did
go
not
ahead?
create any of it.
Oh, well, I think maybe Charlie has something to say on the matter, so go ahead, Charlie.
can somebody turn on my camera?
There we go.
There. All right, here I am. I've been here all along, Jack, and I want to say two things, or probably a little bit more, but I understood what Jack was talking about as a young ecologist. I'll be 80 next week. When I was 20 and decided not to have children for all the reasons Jack is talking about. Now, I disagree maybe with a few details of what Jack's saying, but I think, and as I've reported to this group before when I talked about limits to growth, that fundamentally, while there may be some issues with details, and we certainly hope we can put in, I put PV panels on my roof. but I'm not going to live long enough to get my money, let alone my energy back. And so there may be some rich people like us in North America who can make this transition to something else. But with most of these 8 billion people dependent upon industrially derived fertilizer, not to mention all the enormous infrastructure Jack talks about, roads and pipes and God knows what else. I cannot see it as other than something like, maybe not quite as brutal, that Jack talks about. And it's just off our discussion. And even it's off the discussion of the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome original report, it's all there. And I can show you, I published on it a lot, that it's basically right on the money. We don't have anything that contradicts it on a massive scale. That's the main issue. We may not understand it fully. And this is the Club of Rome. And should be the most knowledgeable people of these issues. And yet most of the talks that I tune into here act as if it were not the case. And it's interesting. And nobody likes to hear bad news, and everybody wants to shoot the messenger. But what are we going to do about it? And Jack doesn't have a good answer either. But I didn't breed Jack, and you did.
So I think Jack already had answers that would be too painful to consider unless we really have a deep belief that worse is going to happen. So I think, thank you, Charlie. I think we'll move on to Mike Nickerson's question.
Great. Thanks very much. Hi, Jack. It's good to see you again. I noticed that almost all of your explanations are assuming a technological lifestyle. You're assuming that we're going to have computers and solar systems and even cars. And even right now, for every person that has a car, there's 6 or 7 in the world that don't have cars. So there's something they know that they can manage that we can't. And the whole background of the more fun, less stuff thing is, if we shift our culture from a material acquisition thing and relate more directly with the life support of biological processes, we could limit that overshoot considerably. I'm not suggesting we can support 8 billion people ongoing, but we have to tell them what the problem is, but we could also tell them that part of the solution is to get more satisfaction out of living and less out of stuff. And I don't see that in what you're presenting.
I think your observation is correct. I see a problem coming at us so fast that it's sort of like, my background's auto safety research. And what you're telling me is, won't people put their seatbelts on in the middle of a crash? And I'm saying, I don't think they'll see it. I don't think they'll put the belts on. I think they're going to suffer the consequences. Knowing how to live on a potato patch is good. I'm not saying that skill is not good. I'm just saying that the number of people on the face of the earth that can grow their own food and not have to go across the river and raid the neighbor's potato patch is very small in comparison to what we currently have. And in the process of the time available, which is only 80 years, in that time frame, if you're smart enough to grow potatoes and have a photovoltaic panel to keep the lights on, you're just a target for for every one of you, there's going to be 100 people that are going to see the lights on. They're going to come through, dig up your potatoes and leave if they don't eat you in the process. So it's a timetable problem. I mean, I'd like people to be more responsible. I'd like to see them try and live in a reasonable way. I just don't think there's time to make the transition, and we should know that too.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. And I hear you saying they need to know what the problem is, but why don't you tell them what part of the solution is? Because then maybe we would have 20 potato farmers and only 80 people coming. And that would mean that some of the potato farmers would be missed and the chances of repopulation would go up again, right? Like it's part of the message. It's not all that we're doomed. Yes, we're doomed. I'm not debating that. But the way that human beings can live on this planet, there's creatures out not far from here that have no technology whatsoever, and they live healthy lives, nibbling on the buds of trees in the wintertime. You know, we can do way better than that. We can have buildings that capture sunshine. But we need to tell people that there is a channel that can make a much better outcome than what we have by just continuing with what we've got.
Okay. Thank you.
Wait.
Oh, sorry, go ahead and.
There's more of an answer than that. And the question is, can you describe the number of people and where they're going to live and assume that they have no enemies? What does it look like?
I'm building it. Come and visit. It's there's a lot of people catching on. Again, you're not going to help them if you don't tell them there's a way out. If you're just saying you're doomed, they're not going to be able to do anything. They need to have a bit of a blueprint of type of human being that doesn't have this deep immersion in material technology. Just add it to your message. More fun, less stuff.
In the background, I see linen curtains and a cotton shirt and plastic buttons. I mean, are you planning on giving all of that up when you're down to eating your potatoes from each season?
There's enough clothes at the reuse center here to last my grandchildren.
And then?
Then we'll know how to make clothes again. We used to make clothes for hundreds of years before we had technology making clothes for us.
Absolutely. And there was a small number of us.
Yeah.
And if you broke a boot, you froze your foot, you lost it.
Okay. John
Sorry,
Mayer,
Barry.
go ahead
Mike,
with your
call
question.
me, Mike. We should pursue this.
And Michael Dowd, you're on after John. Your mic's very low, John.
How about now?
That's an improvement.
Okay. All right. Jack, I wrote something recently that basically saying why the oil sands won't save us. It had a hypothetical person, Bob in Regina, who had to drive, who was equidistant from the oil sands, fracking fields, and virgin oil fields. In the virgin oil fields, the EROI was 100 to 1. Bob would drive out there with his 1,000 liters of gas and bring back net 85,000 liters of gas after a week, and the party was on. Then he'd drive to when that ran out, he went to the fracking fields with an EROI of 15 to 1. And he'd drive out there and come back after a week with, say, 12,000 liters of gas, and he could get by. He could do most of the things. A society would survive, and he could get by, but the good times weren't on it, required discipline. And then when that ran out, he had to go to the oil fields with the ROI of 4 to 1, and basically virtually impossible to survive and maintain any kind of sophisticated society. So my question is, unfortunately, because of money, we have this market, this world oil market where everything, oil is priced the same. It's not based on cost, it's based on just oil. If it's oil, it sells at the same price of any other oil. And it obscures the fact that our oil sources, our energy sources have radically different cost structures. And I'm just wondering, if this may not be your question, it might be more Charlie's question, but Charlie isn't any more of a marketing guy than I am. How do we get across the idea that our richest oil fields are declining, And how do we differentiate, on a time perspective, what's going to happen when the richest stuff starts to run dry significantly?
Well, when you pump the last gallon out of the ground, the lights go out, right?
Yeah.
And what all you've done is said it's harder and harder each year to pump enough oil to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
Because the sources are deeper and less dense.
Yeah.
You're working at the margins. I suggest, and I'm a learning theorist, you know that, don't work at the margins, work at the limits. If it doesn't work at the limits, it doesn't make any difference what you do at the margins. And and the fact that you're talking to a public who's made every decision in their life at the margin, how do you get them to convert over to the other way of making the analysis at the limit? I mean, remember I told you about turning down the air conditioner in the car and you'll get more than 400 miles? That person really thinks that he's doing a good job. He's going to get a little farther, but he hasn't changed the limit condition.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to get the conversation changed from margin to limit, because the limits, the kids are going to have to deal with the limit, not with the margins.
So Jack, I think people are wanting to know, how do we do that? How would you suggest we get people to think differently?
Well, now you're getting into the third presentation that I want to do for K-Core, and that has, how do you do the transition? You know, what changes in behavior are big enough to allow the current 8 billion people to sneak through into a life in 2100 that isn't awful.
Okay.
And there's two mechanisms. One of which is that the group decides not to have kids. And you have this enormous die-off from old age with replacement parts that are small enough to get along with what you have left. That's the solution I'm working on. That has to do with people recognizing that the limit is really terrible, and that whatever terrible things a group has to do to get people to stop having kids, the group would be willing to do it. Like the group decides you can't have slaves. And as far as the slave owners and plantations were concerned, you destroyed their lifestyle. And they were never going to do it by public opinion, but they were forced to give up slaves. So I'm arguing that if the public decides to force people to give up kids for 50 years, we have a path forward. There's another solution you're not going to like at all, but a single person, and I say a single person because the science is now becoming powerful enough that a single person can create a virus to do a 99% culling of the 8 billion. And that person, he's an independent actor. You have no control over what he does. He can create the culling solution. And I'm sure there are people who have that ability today. There's an example being that we had the atomic bomb in the shop days before we used it. Okay, so we used the atomic bomb, we dropped it on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and then we haven't dropped any bombs on anybody else. But we've proceeded 70 years. The question is, what do you think is in the garage in terms of killing people? I'm sure all the tools are there to kill off 90%, 99%, 99.9%. And not that, those tools were built by huge research groups. And now we're getting to the point where that kind of culling can be created by one individual.
Jack,
one graduate student in biology.
Yeah. So Jack, you said we wouldn't like it, and I believe you. So hopefully the rest of us can come up with some more gentle solutions. I think we better move on. I'll remind everybody that we only have about less than 15 minutes left now, and try to keep your questions and answers brief, because we have more questions than we can fit into the next 15 minutes. So Michael Dowd, do you want to take it away?
Sure, thanks, Barry. Yeah, Jack, I was just curious, because the limits to growth study and, well, first of all, I thought your presentation was great. Thank you. I'm wondering about the things that weren't factored in, such as abrupt climate change, where you've got like 10,000 years of climate change in half a human lifetime. That wasn't, so the stability that allowed for the growing of grain at scale and civilization and population to skyrocket up to 8 billion, that's gone. And there's nothing we can do to bring that back. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see, I mean, it's interesting. Most everybody else here is sort of, you know, saying that they're more optimistic than you. And I'm actually, it's not optimism or pessimism. I don't think we're going to make it to 2100 because we're going to see a 3, 4, 5 degrees Celsius rise between now and then. And we're likely to see, I think, a multi-breadbasket failure in the next 10 years. So I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about the loss of the stability of the Holocene and the rapid feedbacks that are already in process, that even if 8 billion of us woke up tomorrow as an eco-saint, or if 8 billion of us died tomorrow, cutting all carbon emissions, these things would still be out of our control.
Okay. You already saw the slide that said, if all of this list of terrible things that might befall humanity were not there, energy could crush us by itself. So let's assume that some engineer tomorrow creates some little organism that can eat carbon dioxide and make it precipitate out on the bottom of the ocean. That if you just took that off the plate, then we would have no more emissions. Okay. Would that stop the injuries caused by decreasing energy? I don't think it does.
No, I don't either.
Yeah, the other side of that is another guy figures out how to well, let's just leave it at that. That if we solve the climate problem, if we put up a sun shield and we stopped emitting carbon dioxide, and we were given, 500 years for those two processes to get us back to 350. And we would no longer need the sun shield, but we would now operate on at equilibrium. Now,
Okay.
Let's assume that we only had, 5 million people on the face of the earth, and they implemented that solution. Would they be okay? Is there a place to shelter 5 million people with enough energy to keep them cool and feed them?
Yeah, I see our problem as ecological overshoot, not climate.
Well, ecological overshoot is based on consumption. And I just told you that we got rid of 99.9% of the people. So our ecological footprint of the 5 million people is almost zero.
Right, but how would that keep like 400 nuclear meltdowns from happening? How that with that quick level of population and industrial decline, I just don't see how we would not have dozens, at least, if not more, nuclear meltdowns.
All right. So the model that I built, and it's at my website, says that not only does the group decide to have no children, it decides to build 3 cities that will support 50 million people total. Now, what's the obligation of the 8 billion? And now you got to remember that since there's no children in the 8 billion, the first year there's no first grader, 1-year-olds. The second year there's no. At the end of the 50th year, the youngest person outside of these 3 cities is 50 years old. So also, when we made this agreement, they were the ones who put up the energy to build these cities, and they were the ones who said, if I'm one of the lucky people who gets to have a child and go to the city, that not only that, I'll go there and everybody else will agree not to run into the city and ruin it. The third part is the part you just asked. The remaining population, the 8 billion, has to take on the responsibility of decommissioning the current infrastructure. They're the ones who take the chemical plants apart when they're not needed anymore and diffuse them. And that includes all of radioactive waste and all of the the cooling chambers at all the nuclear power plants. When the last man finally dies at the 80th year, not only does he own all the GM stock, but he's blessed and decommissioned all the bad places. And we had 80 years to decommission them and put all of our energy into doing it because we have this vision that these three cities will carry on. And it was a good idea that they can carry on, and we're not sacrificing anything. I mean, that they're full-time jobs for these people to clean up these messes. And since every year there's a smaller number of people driving, we don't need every refinery. So we just decommission the ones that we don't need anymore. Okay. So the question is, if you make the dynamic model, you have to say, can I change the mass flows fast enough with the energy that I have? And the question is, that's an engineering problem. I think it's doable. You can't spend any money on fighting wars.
30 more seconds.
And you might be giving out aspirin and morphine so that your aged medical expenses don't run you into the ground. Okay. And you may have to use robotics to take care of people in their old age, because there's no children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to take care of them. So it is the view of making such a huge transition has absolutely nothing to do with the current cultural values. Cultural values have just taken an enormous shift to make this thing work. And then the only way that cultural values can make this enormous shift is that the person has a clear view of not taking on the new cultural values, which is going to create some injuries, versus taking on the new cultural values, which have their own penalties. Lots of people are going to get injured by the new cultural value, but any normal person can look and say, it's better to take on the new cultural values with the penalties associated with them than continuing on the present path, which just ruins everybody.
Hey, thank you, Jack and Michael. Great discussion. I think we better move on probably to our last question. I just want to, before we do that, point out that Claude Butner has pointed the way to a couple of books and some links that he thinks are relevant, but he doesn't want to speak to them. So Samrat, over to you.
Hi, Jack. Thanks so much for this amazing talk. My question you partly answered, but still it's, what do you think of like a world which is post-collapse? Like, how do you envision that, based on all that you've explained right now?
That's a really good
Thanks.
question. All of my work is not post-collapse. Collapse is what happens when you get in the middle of the desert and run out of gas. All of my work says you're at the 200-mile mark. Do you have any options? Okay.
Right.
There's no way to decommission a nuclear power plant if you've collapsed. You just suffer the radiation bleed out, which Michael talked about. So you cannot collapse. Collapse is its own painful experience. And there is no, and the guys that say, oh, we'll just, we'll find a river valley, all 10 of us, and we'll grow potatoes. And Mr. Nickerson has already stated that he thinks that he has some models for how these new communities will be able to muddle forward. And I'm saying his community won't be able to muddle forward during collapse. It'll be consumed. You cannot, that part of making the decision to take the penalties of a new social contract, which limits your behavior, is that there isn't a nice way forward. And you're trying to find a way forward that doesn't go through that. If it goes through that, you've injured everybody. Yeah. You've already injured everybody. In fact, there's a good chance that if we just, there'll be enough toxins in the system if we just collapse. There's a book by a fellow by the name of Weinberg, The World Without Us. and he's talking about what would happen to if people just disappeared, and then we left Houston to bleed out. We left all the nuclear power to bleed out, and we left the subway systems to fill up with water. And there's not a nice way forward. And I don't want to do that. So I am not looking for a solution after collapse. I'm looking for a solution today before collapse.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jack. And I think that brings us pretty much to the close of this formal session. And people can stay on after the recording is finished so that you can ask, have a chat. Jean Doherty, I'll turn the forum over to you.
Thank you, Barry. And Jack, it's my distinct pleasure as chairman of Canadian Association for the Club of Rome to thank you on behalf of our association for this absolutely thought-provoking, if not very controversial presentation that you gave us today. I think that there's a lot of food for thought in what you've said, and I really look forward to your third presentation on how we can get out of this, what you propose as some of the solutions for what we're doing. So I look forward to your next presentation. For those of you who are here, I would ask you or strongly suggest that you look at our website, canadiancore.com. There you can get information about how to look at this talk again, as well as any of the other presentations that we've had on Zoom, on the Zoom series. To do this, you look at the Stay Informed section, and there you will get this particular, the link to this particular talk and all the other previous ones you've had. You can search for the videos that are already on that website, and you can look at them at any time and at your leisure. If you're interested in becoming a member of KCOR, you can find the information on the website about how to become a member of KCOR. As well, if you're interested in finding out and donating to our efforts to try and do things, you can do that on our website as well. So again, I strongly suggest that you look at this, and thank you very much for coming today. And thank you, Jack, for this great presentation.
Thank you.